The blizzard came early that year, meaner, louder, and more brutal than any man had seen in decades. It didn't whisper down from the mountain like winter usually did. It screamed. And when it screamed, it ripped shingles from rooftops, snapped fences like brittle twigs, and hurled frost through cracks in the walls like knives through linen. It came sudden and fast, the sky turning to bruised silver in hours, then black, and then white with snow so heavy it drowned horses standing in corrals. By nightfall, every man in the hollow knew something was different about this storm, and by morning the ones who still had walls around them were the lucky ones. Only one cabin stood untouched, not untouched by snow, no, but untouched by collapse. It was Clara Boone's cabin, the widow, the strange one, the quiet one, the one nobody really spoke to, unless it was to mention how odd she was, or how out of place her old country ways felt here. No one wanted to admit they feared her, but they did, or maybe they just feared what they couldn't understand, and there was a lot about Clara Boone's home they didn't understand, especially that peculiar layer of thick, smooth mud she'd packed all around her cabin walls the summer before, like she was frosting a cake with dirt and straw. They'd laughed at her for it, teased her boy Elijah at the creek, said she was losing her mind out there. One man said she'd read too many books from the trading post and gotten herself twisted with foreign nonsense. Another said it was a witch's thing, something old world and cursed. But when the storm ended, and all the other cabins lay broken like children's toys crushed underfoot, Clara's still stood, straight, warm, bone dry inside. And that's when the stories began to spread, not about the storm, but about her. Because if the mud wall had saved her cabin, what else could it do? But let's not get ahead of ourselves. You need to know what came before, the days when Clara was still just that widow woman, and the storm was only a whisper in the trees. It was the summer after Jacob Boone died, the second summer without him, the kind of summer that baked the earth till it split like cracked lips. Everything smelled of dust and pine sap, and the creek by the fields ran so low it barely covered the minnows. That's when Clara began doing it, hauling mud in buckets, mixing it with straw, and plastering it along the outside of her cabin walls in thick, deliberate coats. From sunup to near dark, she worked, her dress caked up to the knees, her hands grey and veiny with dried clay. No one helped her. Even Elijah just watched from the porch, small, skinny, still too quiet for a boy of 10. They'd buried Jacob the winter before, after a fever took him in the space of 3 days, and Elijah hadn't said more than a sentence or two to anyone since. "She's covering the place in filth," said Wade Carver, spitting beside his ox yoke as he passed her place. "Like a hog barn. Damn shame. She thinks it'll keep it cool," said Mitch Duncan, his neighbor on the east side. "Heard her tell my wife it's an old way. European, maybe? I don't know. Sounds like superstition. I seen her walk around the cabin at night," said old Silas, the trapper. "Barefoot, in circles, chanting maybe, or praying, might be the same thing." But Clara kept working, and working, even when folks stopped waving, even when she heard boys whispering about her behind the hay bales, even when she had to go down to the creek 5 times a day to haul up more mud, and her arms shook from the weight. She never stopped, and when she was done, by midsummer, the walls looked different, smoother, thicker, like the cabin had grown a skin. That fall, people forgot about it. They turned their minds toward the harvest, and the coming cold, and the worry about how deep the snow might be this year. The soil had been stingy with corn, and the bean rows had blackened too early. They had other things to gossip about, and Clara Boone, with her ugly mud walls and silent little boy, faded back into the background. But then came the first snow, then the second, and then the storm. The storm hit so hard, it sounded like iron being torn in the sky. It pulled whole chimneys sideways, smashed windows, pried roof shingles free like loose teeth. Mitch Duncan's house lost its front wall before dawn. Wade Carver's roof caved in before morning coffee. Even old Silas's deep-dug log shack began to crack under the weight of the snow. By the time they could get out and look around, most cabins in the hollow had either buckled, sagged, or were on the verge of doing so, except hers. Clara's place stood like it always had, except quieter. Somehow, untouched, folks started coming by, first just to stare, then to ask. They didn't say sorry for what they'd said before, but they sure started talking nicer. "I don't reckon I've ever seen anything like it," Mitch Duncan muttered, hat in hand, staring up at the cabin wall like it was a church mural. Clara didn't answer. She only opened her door enough to pass Elijah through, so he could sit on the porch and watched the hollow without a word. Wade Carver came 2 days later. "Say, Miss Boone," he said awkwardly, "that mud stuff, what's it made of exactly? Clay and straw, right? Or is it Mixed with something? Clara didn't answer him either, just looked at him with those tired eyes and went back inside. But that was only the beginning, because the storm didn't leave when it passed. It stayed in its own way. The frost dug in deep, trees cracked from the cold, more roofs sank, children got sick, horses spooked in the night, and yet still, Clara's place stood tall, smoke curling gently from the chimney, lights flickering behind the glass. It was too much for some. 3 men came to her place that night, saying they just wanted to see how it was built. They knocked, waited, knocked again. When she didn't answer, one of them, Luther Grayson, put a shoulder to the door. He never made it inside. Something hit him before he could finish the push. Not a person, not a thing, just a sound, he said later. A sound like 100 whispers at once. Too soft to hear, but loud enough to shake you inside. He said his legs gave out, that he saw something in the mud, moving, breathing, watching him. But Luther drank more than he talked sense, so no one listened, except for Mitch. Because Mitch had seen something too, earlier that day, a patch of the mud wall where the frost hadn't touched it. The rest of the ground was brittle with ice, but this spot, it steamed, gave off warmth like breath. He swore he put his hand to it and felt a heartbeat. Maybe she didn't build the wall, he whispered to his wife that night. Maybe it built itself. But even that wasn't what truly changed everything. That came 2 weeks later, when the earth shook. It started deep, rumbling like thunder. And then, just as folks were climbing out to check the sky, the mountains groaned, and the ice cracked wide, and the hillside slid. Landslide. It swallowed everything in its path. Trees, barns, 2 cabins, even Wade Carver's place. Gone in minutes, except Clara's. It should have been first. It sat low, right where the land dropped, but it held. Not a crack, not a stone moved from the chimney. The earth tore around it like water around a stone, and that's when they stopped whispering about the mud. They started fearing it, because maybe it wasn't just a wall, and maybe she wasn't just a widow. After the landslide, they didn't send anyone to check on Clara Boone. No one dared. The hollow was quiet in that strange, snow-muted way where every creak and crackle sounds twice as loud as it should. The sky remained a flat grey, low as a lid, pressing down over the broken land like the storm had left behind its own kind of silence. A deeper one. Even the wind came soft, cautious like it too, feared what it might disturb. Wade Carver's house was buried under 6 feet of slush and pine and broken timber. His wife had made it out with their youngest, but Wade hadn't. The town had lost men to accidents before, to bears, to fevers, but not like this. Not to the earth itself, rolling over like a stirred beast. Not to something that should have taken Clara Boone's house first, but somehow didn't touch it at all. In the saloon, voices lowered whenever her name came up. In church, no one prayed for her. They just avoided saying her name, like it might draw attention, but the talk kept growing, even if no one dared say it directly. "She's not right," folks whispered. "She knows something. I seen her once, years back, doing things in the woods, carving signs, burying bones in jars." It didn't matter that no one had real proof. It never did. It just took fear and enough cold nights to make suspicion turn solid. But Clara kept to herself. The cabin didn't light up at night anymore, not like before. The chimney still smoked, but no one saw Elijah come out to sit anymore. Some said she'd sent him away. Others whispered he'd never really been her son at all. One morning, Mitch Duncan stood out front of the general store, staring down at a cracked horseshoe that had been blown off during the storm. He didn't speak for a long time, just kept looking at it like it held some hidden truth. When he finally did talk, he said something strange. "She was here before we came," he said, almost to himself. "I mean, not her exactly, but her people. The ones who knew this land before we ever cut trees here. You ever wonder where she came from before Jacob married her?" "Back east, wasn't it?" said a man nearby. Mitch shook his head. "No, she never said east, just said before." That unsettled more than one man that day. Clara's cabin wasn't just standing, it was unharmed. Not a single board bent, not a window cracked, and yet it sat now with this aura about it, some quiet, humming weight that made the hair on your arms rise if you got too close. Even when the wind didn't blow, it felt like the place breathed. And inside, behind those strange mud walls, Clara moved slowly. She had not left the property since the landslide, not even to fetch water. She no longer needed to. Beneath the hearthstone, deep in the hidden crawl space her husband never knew existed, something old stirred gently, like a muscle twitching in sleep. The mud wasn't just clay, it wasn't just straw and dirt. It was memory, and it remembered how to protect what belonged to it. Clara had not always understood the way it worked. Years ago, when she was a girl living near the eastern marshes, her grandmother had taught her bits and pieces. Mud was not just mud, she'd said, not when mixed in the old way, not when whispered to properly. There were things in the earth, deep things, that could hear you if you knew how to speak to them, and if they answered, they would protect. But there was a price. There was always a price. It wasn't magic, not the fairy tale kind. No sparks, no chance. It was just a knowing, a shaping, a pact between hands and soil, a deal made with something bigger than yourself, something slower, something older. And when Jacob died, his body stiffening in their bed while Elijah cried so hard he nearly choked, Clara had gone to the edge of the creek and sunk her hands in up to the elbows. She didn't speak, she didn't beg, she simply asked, quietly, with every part of her heart. And the mud had answered. It had held, it had remembered. Now with the landslide behind them and a creeping silence in the town, Clara sat inside, feeding the fire with small, even pieces of wood. She didn't need to burn much. The walls held warmth like skin holds blood. Elijah slept under quilts beside her, his face no longer so pale, but she knew it wouldn't last. Not the warmth, not the peace, not the silence, because people don't like what they can't control, and what they fear they seek to break. She'd seen it before, back when her grandmother's own cabin had been burned down by townsfolk who claimed it was cursed. Her grandmother had only laughed. They think fire can break a pact with the earth? She'd whispered before the flames took her, and now Clara felt the same scent in the air, that hot iron scent of suspicion, of coming confrontation. It began with Reverend Tolliver. He stood up that Sunday in the half-collapsed chapel, Bible in hand, and said words no one wanted to say out loud, but all were thinking. There are unnatural things in our midst, he said. Shelters that stand when others fall, mud that holds when wood breaks, heat where there should be cold. That is not God's protection. That is something else, and it must be named. He never said Clara's name, but he didn't have to. By that night, 6 men were gathered near the blacksmith's barn. Not with torches, not yet, but with voices sharp enough to spark them. She's got something in that mud. Chemicals, maybe. Foreign things. No chemicals can hold up against an avalanche. That's not natural. My boy says he heard whispering near her place. Said it wasn't her voice. Said it came from the walls. Damn thing watched me, said Luther Grayson, clutching a flask with both hands. She's got power there, someone else muttered. And if she's got it, and we don't, well, what happens next storm? When we all fall again and she sits fine? They didn't say it that night, but they would, and Clara knew. She felt it in the mud, the way it pulsed now, not just with warmth, but with warning, the way the floorboards beneath her gave the faintest tremor when she stepped too close to the hearth, the way the walls listened. She'd made a deal, and the deal had held, but now the deal would be tested. The earth doesn't ask permission to protect what belongs to it, but it does have limits. Elijah stirred in his sleep. Ma, he whispered, voice dry. They're gonna come, aren't they? She didn't answer right away, just brushed the hair from his forehead. Yes, baby, they are. He opened his eyes. Will the wall stop them? She paused. Then, the wall only stops what comes to destroy, not what comes to understand. And that was the difference. If they came with axes, they would find the wall waiting. If they came with questions, real questions, asked with hearts open, they might find something else. But deep down, Clara feared she already knew which path they would take. The next day, snow melted just enough to allow footsteps down the valley road. A man walked it slow. Not in a group, not with torches, but alone. Mitch Duncan. He held no weapon, only a wrapped parcel under his arm and a wool scarf tight around his throat. He stopped 20 feet from her cabin, hands visible, body loose with weariness. Miss Boone, he called gently. Clara, I ain't here to accuse. I just want to understand. A long pause. Then the door creaked open. She stepped out, wrapped in her old brown shawl, eyes sharp but calm. Behind her, the cabin glowed softly, not with firelight, but with life. Mitch took a careful step closer. I brought something, a piece of wood, from my house. It's cracked through. I wanted to show you. Maybe you could tell me why mine fell and yours didn't. Clara looked at him for a long moment, then stepped forward, not to take the wood, but to place her hand on the snow beside his boot. She pressed her palm flat, whispered something too quiet for him to hear. The ground shifted, just slightly, enough for Mitch to stumble back, enough for him to feel, not hear, a sound, like something ancient had just opened one eye beneath them. He swallowed. What was that? Clara looked up. That's what you woke up when you came here. All of us did. The trees, the mud, the mountains. They remember what this land used to be, before cabins, before fences. Some of it wants to protect us, some of it doesn't care. And yours? The wall? She looked toward it. The mud glistened, even in the weak winter light, steam rising faintly from its seams. It cares, she said. Behind them, wind stirred the trees, but not a single branch near Clara's cabin moved. Mitch turned to leave. I'll try to tell the others, he said quietly. Clara nodded, but she already knew. By then, it was too late. By the end of that week, something changed in the way the hollow felt. It wasn't just the cold, though that had returned with new teeth, sinking deep into the bones of every ruined homestead, frosting what little remained of the broken roofs and leaning chimneys. It was deeper than temperature. The silence had become charged, the way a quiet church gets just before a funeral starts. Like the valley itself was holding its breath, and the people, what was left of them, started to gather in clumps again, not to mourn, not to pray, but to plan. It wasn't just about Clara Boone anymore. That was the part no one would say out loud, but it was there in every drawn face and every sideways glance. What they feared now wasn't the woman, or her boy, or even the mud wall. What they feared was that maybe she was right, that maybe the old things were awake. And if they were, who else might they choose to protect or to ignore? And when fear gets too big, it does what it always does. It turns into anger. Reverend Tolliver met with the blacksmith and 3 others in the charred frame of the church, huddled over a map of the hollow, half burned at the corners. They spoke in whispers, eyes darting, hands clenched. "This land is cursed," said the Reverend. "Not just hers, all of it. We've built our homes on something old, something we didn't ask permission from, and now it's waking up." "It started with her," said the smith. "Whatever she did to that cabin, it opened something, and now look." Another voice added, "My dog howled 3 nights straight, wouldn't stop, not till I tied him in the barn. My boy says he saw something crawl across the Duncan field. No feet, no legs, just dragging." All eyes turned to Tolliver. "We need to purify the hollow," he said. "Cleanse the soil, remove what doesn't belong." No one said the word burn, but no one had to. Mitch Duncan knew the storm was coming before the snow even began to fall again. He felt it in his knees, in the way the wind shifted direction at night, in the way the smoke from his hearth refused to rise straight. He felt it in his dreams, where he walked the hollow and all the houses had melted, sunk into the earth, except Clara's, which stood taller than before, its walls pulsing gently like a living thing. In the dream, Elijah stood on the porch, eyes glowing like coals, saying nothing, just watching. And yet Mitch didn't fear it like the others did. He was tired of fear. His home had collapsed. His animals were dead. His youngest coughed blood most nights now. And when he stood near Clara's wall, he felt nothing except stillness. Peace, even. That was what the others didn't understand. The wall wasn't just keeping the cold out, it was keeping something worse in. The morning the second storm came down, he wrapped his boy in 2 coats and strapped his wife to the sled with ropes. "We're going to Clara's," he said. They didn't argue, because they'd seen it too. That strange, gentle warmth that radiated from the mud wall, the way the wind bent around it, the way the snow refused to cling to it for long. Whatever it was, curse or blessing, it was safer than staying in the wreck of their home. He wasn't the only one. By nightfall, 6 more families had made their way to Clara's doorstep. None of them knocked. They just stood outside, quiet, eyes wide, hoping. The children shivered. The women wept. The door opened slowly, and Clara stepped out. She said nothing for a long time, just looked at them. Her boy stood behind her, holding a lantern. Then she nodded. Once, slow. "You can stay," she said, "but not all the way inside. The walls only have so much memory, too many hearts, and it starts to forget which ones are safe." She pointed to the side of the cabin, where a second lean-to had been built. It hadn't been there days ago. "The wall's been building again," she said. Mitch blinked. "The wall's building itself?" She gave him a look, not amused, not afraid. "Sometimes, when it senses what's needed." The lean-to was thick, curved, lined inside with the same straw-clay mixture, but smoother, more deliberate, like it had been poured, not placed. No one questioned it. They just moved in, and that's when it really started. The next storm didn't howl like the first one. It screamed. It came with thunder, not from the sky but from the ground. Trees fell without warning. Ice flew sideways. Snow hit like hammers. And still, Clara's cabin stood. Inside, the walls glowed faintly, not with light but with warmth. An ancient kind of heat, the kind that doesn't burn, the kind that remembers. The children stopped coughing. The mothers fell asleep without crying. And for a moment, it felt like peace, until the fire started. Not inside, not near, but from up the hill, where the Reverend and his men had stood beneath the pines, setting torches to dry limbs, hoping to purify what they didn't understand. They hadn't expected the fire to spread backward. The trees didn't burn like they should have. They burned too fast, like they wanted to, like they'd been waiting. And then the wind changed, the fire turned, and in seconds, it was racing downhill, straight toward them. Not toward Clara's cabin, but toward the church, toward the blacksmiths, toward their homes. Panic hit like a thrown stone. Men ran, horses screamed. The fire swallowed everything in its path, except the wall. It reached Clara's place and stopped. The flames curled upward, higher and higher, until they licked at the sky like grasping hands. But they never touched her cabin, never even scorched the lean-to. Inside, Clara stood at the hearth, eyes closed, her hand pressed against the mud. Her lips didn't move. She didn't speak, but she listened, because the wall was speaking back. It said, "They came with fire. We remember fire. But you asked us not to harm, so we will not. Not unless..." She nodded. Her hand fell away. Outside, the wind shifted again. The fire died, not slowly, instantly, like someone blew out a match. Ash fell like snow. The entire upper ridge of the hollow glowed red and black, charred, dead, but the valley below, silent, still, unharmed. Mitch stepped out into the cold, blinking at the sudden quiet. "Is it over?" he whispered. Clara stepped beside him. "No," she said. "It's only beginning." He turned. "What do you mean?" She looked up at the mountain ridge, where the fire had started, where something else now stirred in the snow, shapes moving, crawling, dragging. "The wall remembers us, but the land remembers more. It remembers who broke it, who bled it, and it's waking up." Mitch followed her gaze, and what he saw made his breath freeze in his chest. Figures, not people, not beasts, shapes made of snow and soot and ash and mud, crawling down the mountain, slow, deliberate. The earth had answered, and it was coming. The hollow was no longer silent. It shivered, as if the ground itself had caught a fever, and every root and stone beneath the snow was twitching in some long-awaited dream. The ridgeline that had burned 2 nights earlier still glowed faintly beneath its coat of ash and ice, and yet the flame was not the only thing that had stirred there. What descended from that scorched spine now was slower than fire, but just as final. Mitch Duncan had not slept. He'd kept watch from the front edge of the lean-to Clara's wall had built, sitting on a stump that had appeared overnight, smooth, hollowed slightly at the center, as if shaped for watching. The air smelled wrong, not of smoke anymore, but of turned soil and distant rot. Old earth, woken earth, the kind that hadn't seen light since the world was younger. Elijah sat beside him, quiet. The boy hadn't spoken in hours, not since he'd woken in the middle of the night and told Mitch, "They're not ghosts." Mitch hadn't asked what he meant. He didn't need to, because he could see them now too, just shapes at first. Wide-shouldered, low, humanoid, but not human. Mud-covered, yes, but not wet. Their forms shifted when the light caught them just right, the way old trees look like twisted men until you blink. Some walked on 2 limbs, some dragged what looked like tools, shovels, stakes, planks. Others carried nothing, moving in slow lines, heads bowed like mourners, and all of them, were moving toward the hollow. Clara didn't speak that day. She didn't need to. Her face said enough. She'd changed since the fire, not in body. She was still the same rail-thin, sharp-eyed widow, with the hands of a woman who dug graves and lifted stone by herself. But there was a stillness in her now that was different, a rootedness, like something beneath the cabin had joined with her spine. At mid-morning, the first of the creatures crossed the creek bed. The water had frozen over thick, but their steps didn't crack it. Instead, the ice seemed to shift, forming gentle indentations like the surface of a pond bending under a leaf. They moved without hurry, without threat, and yet every man who saw them felt the weight of something ancient settle in their chest. The children didn't cry. They watched, open-eyed, silent. One little girl, Mitch's own niece, asked, "Are they going to fix the houses?" No one answered her, because none of them knew. By late afternoon, Clara finally moved. She stepped out into the snow with no coat, just her thick shawl pulled close around her, her bare hands pale against the storm-gray light. She walked straight into the center of the clearing, to the old fire pit where the townsfolk had once held dances and Sunday meals in better years. And then she knelt. The ground didn't shake, the sky didn't open, but every feeling in the hollow changed. Even the wind stopped. The creatures halted, all at once, as if listening. She touched the soil, not to command, not to plead, to invite, and that's when they moved. Not toward her, but toward the shattered cabins, the broken fences, the burned posts. They dispersed like workers at a silent call, and within minutes, they had begun rebuilding. But not like humans would. They didn't hammer or saw. They didn't measure or lift. Instead, they shaped, they grew. Mitch watched as one reached down, scooped a handful of ash and snow, and smoothed it over a fallen wall. The wood didn't reappear, but something like wood grew up in its place, a living form, ribbed and strong and warm to the touch, steaming slightly in the winter air. Another creature pressed both hands to a collapsed chimney, and it unfolded upward, slow and pulsing, like a plant breaking through the soil, brick by brick, shaped from what looked like hardened clay. None of it was natural, but none of it was wrong either. It was just different. The hollow was being rewritten, one form at a time, and in the center of it all stood Clara. Elijah stood beside her now, eyes wide. "They're fixing what we broke," he whispered to no one, but Clara heard him. "No," she said gently. "They're remembering it, as it should have been, before we forced the land into something it wasn't." Mitch took a slow step forward. "What are they?" he asked. Clara turned to him. "They're what comes when the land finally answers." He shook his head. "That sounds like punishment." She smiled, a sad, tired smile. "No, this isn't vengeance. Not yet. This is mercy. Night came early that day. As if the sun had seen enough, the air grew thick like the space between thunder and lightning. The ground continued to warm near the mud walls, radiating a heat that smelled faintly of moss and clay. The children slept easily. The adults did not, because deeper in the trees, not everyone had accepted what was happening. Reverend Tolliver had survived the fire. He'd emerged from the smoking ruins with his face burned, eyes red-rimmed, and fingers curled like claws from the heat. And what emerged with him was not repentance. It was hatred. He no longer called it a plague. He called it devil's work. And when he walked into the clearing that night, he brought with him 2 others, both holding iron tools, faces wrapped in cloth. They did not come to beg. They came to end. Clara met them near the center of the hollow, where the creatures had gathered around a half-built structure that looked like a meeting hall. Only round, dome-like, smoother, no nails, no boards, just shaped earth. Tolliver spat. "This is not God's work," he said. Clara didn't flinch. "It's older." The others stepped forward. "You're making monsters." "I'm listening," she said. Tolliver raised his hand, and then the earth groaned. Not loud, not sudden, but deep, like a sigh, like a warning. The men froze. Beneath their feet, the snow began to melt in perfect circles, revealing the black clay beneath, wet and steaming. The creatures didn't move. They didn't need to. The ground did. One of the men stepped back, only to have his foot sink ankle-deep into what looked like mud, but held with the strength of iron. He screamed. The other swung his iron bar, but it bent in his hand, the metal softening as if heated from inside. Tolliver looked at Clara, eyes wide. "You brought this," he hissed. "No," she said. "You did, years ago, when you planted churches and burned trees and salted land that didn't ask for you. I just asked for help, and the land remembered." And then she turned to the creatures. "You don't need to hurt them," she said. But the land didn't answer her this time. It answered itself. The ground split, not to swallow the men, but to separate them. A ridge rose between the group and the rest of the hollow, slow, inevitable, like a jaw closing. The men fled without a word, stumbling, leaving their tools behind. One left a boot. No one chased them. The ridge remained. Not tall, but tall enough. A boundary, not of punishment, but of choice. On one side, memory, rebuilding, shelter. On the other, fear. The next morning, Clara stood at the edge of the ridge, staring across at the world she used to belong to. Elijah came up beside her, holding a small carved figure he'd made from the new clay walls. It looked like a bird, or maybe a hand. "They won't come back, will they?" he asked. Clara looked at him. "Some might," she said, "if they're willing to listen." "And if they're not?" Clara reached down, pressed her fingers into the mud beside the ridge, and watched as it shifted gently beneath her touch. "If they're not?" The wall remembers. Behind her, the creatures continued their work, not just fixing, but teaching, showing the townsfolk how to shape, how to seal, how to pack the walls just right. The children learned faster than the adults. The elderly learned faster than the proud. And for the first time since the hollow had been settled, there was no hammering, no nails, no sawing of logs, only hands and mud and memory. But far beyond the ridge, back where the snow grew cruel again and the trees no longer whispered kindly, Reverend Tolliver knelt in prayer, not to God, but to something else, something deeper, because he'd felt the wall too, and he knew it wasn't finished. If the land could protect, it could also purge, and he intended to strike first. The snow had stopped falling, but the air was thicker now, like smoke without fire, like the kind of weight that presses down on your shoulders before something gives. It wasn't the season anymore. It was the land. The hollow had changed in ways no eye could fully see, but every heartbeat could feel. Even the animals knew. Birds hadn't returned to the trees. Deer passed wide around the valley. Coyotes yipped at night, but never crossed the ridge. On the warm side of that ridge, the side where Clara's cabin stood, life had become quiet, ordered, almost peaceful. The cabins being rebuilt weren't cabins anymore, not as they had been. They breathed, not in the way lungs breathe, but in the way clay holds warmth. The walls pulsed faintly with memory. The earth retained heat from fire and gave it back slowly. No one built roofs with shingles now. They molded thick domes, insulated with packed straw and smoked moss. Children played in silence, not because they were afraid, but because something inside them had learned to listen. Adults spoke less and worked more. Every movement was a kind of prayer, a quiet offering. They had been changed, not by force, not by command, but by necessity, by proximity to something that asked them to change. And through it all, Clara Boone walked among them, not as a leader, not as a prophet, but as a woman who had once been a widow, a mother, and a mocked outcast. Now, they looked to her not for direction, but for confirmation, for understanding, for what the old stories used to call right walking. But Clara's face had grown hard, not cruel, but guarded. She knew peace never lasted long in a world still shaped by the old violences, especially when men like Reverend Tolliver were still breathing. On the far side of the ridge, Tolliver had not been idle. He'd found the other strays, those who refused to step foot in the rebuilt hollow, those who still called it unnatural, unholy. He found them half-starved in shattered barns, crouched in smoke-ruined basements, scratching out frozen meals and curses in equal measure, and he fed them, not just with food, but with purpose. "They think they're safe," he said, "but they've made a covenant with the earth, and the earth is not ours. They're worshipping mud," another spat. "No," Tolliver whispered, eyes bright and wild. "They're feeding it, and it grows stronger every day. What can we do? We take it back. We burn out the root. We strike at the heart. We break the wall." He spoke of fire, but fire wouldn't be enough this time, so he spoke of salt. Clara awoke before dawn on the 5th day. The wind had shifted again, not in speed, but in taste. The mud near the base of her hearth had dried slightly, not from cold, from something else. The wall had stopped pulsing. She stood barefoot in the packed soil of her cabin and whispered. The floor did not answer. Elijah stirred under his quilts. "Mama?" She didn't speak, just moved toward the ridge. Mitch Duncan saw it first. Grey figures in the distance, hunched and determined, moving down the burnt slope with sacks slung over their backs and glass bottles swinging at their sides. They weren't carrying fire, they were carrying salt. He stumbled back into the dome shelter where the others slept, breath catching. "They're coming," he said. "They mean to poison the land." Salt kills. That was the old trick. Salt the soil, and nothing grows. Salt the mud, and the memory fades. The creatures that had risen from the earth, they had strength, but they were made of the same thing they defended. And salt, pure and cruel, breaks that bond. Clara met him at the edge of the ridge. Behind her, the creatures had stopped working. They stood, still now, shoulder to shoulder, facing the slope with no emotion. "They want to erase us," Mitch said. Clara didn't look surprised. "They want to forget their own shame. What do we do?" She turned to the mud wall, pressed both palms to it, closed her eyes, and asked, not for vengeance, not for protection, but for clarity. "Let them choose," she whispered. "Let them see it for what it is. Let the land show its truth." The wall did not tremble, it did not shine, but every piece of it grew quiet in a new way, and every shelter, every dome, every shaped chimney and warm packed wall followed suit, growing still, soft, inviting. There was no weapon in it, no force, only a choice. When Tolliver crested the ridge with 15 men behind him and sacks of salt dragging from sleds, he expected resistance. He expected a fight, or a fire, or a wall of creatures standing with claws out. What he found was worse. He found welcome. The creatures stood aside. Clara stood at the center of the hollow, her cabin behind her, her child beside her, and the people who had rebuilt their lives in silence standing on either side. The cabins steamed gently in the morning light. The valley was warm, safe, still, and the earth waited. "Is this some kind of trap?" Tolliver hissed. Clara shook her head. "It's an offer," he laughed. "Offer? You can come back," she said. "You can drop the salt and listen. We won't stop you." Behind her, the creatures did not move. Tolliver took one long step forward, snow crunching under his boots. "You think I'd kneel to dirt?" Clara didn't blink. "I didn't kneel. I asked. There's a difference." He looked around. The cabins, the warm light, the people with calm eyes, and he hated it, because it showed what he had lost, what they all had lost. "Burn it," he said, but no one moved. Not one of the men behind him poured salt. Not one raised a hand, because they felt it too now. The invitation, the sorrow, the memory, and the quiet promise that if they dropped their weapons, they would be safe. One man fell to his knees. Another turned and walked away. Tolliver's lips curled. "You're all cowards." He reached for the salt himself, but his fingers never touched the sack, because the earth moved, not violently, not to swallow him, but to rise up. Just enough for him to lose balance. Just enough for him to see, between the grains of snow and ash and clay, the face of something watching him. Not a creature, not a god, just the land, wounded and weary, and no longer willing to be broken. He dropped the salt. It spilled into the snow, and the snow turned black around it. Clara stepped forward. "You can leave," she said. He looked up at her. "You think this place will last?" He rasped. "No," she said. "Nothing lasts, not even memory, but it changes us. That's enough." He turned, walked back over the ridge, alone. Years passed. The hollow remained. The creatures did not stay. They sank slowly into the soil once the rebuilding was done. Not vanishing, just sleeping, resting. The walls still held heat. The snow still fell, but never stayed long. Children grew. Houses shaped themselves with every new season. And Clara Boone grew old. Not slow, not sick, just Tired. The kind of tired that comes from carrying something heavy and finally being allowed to set it down. She died one spring morning beneath a sky so blue it hurt to look at. Elijah found her sitting by the hearth, one hand resting on the wall. The mud was warm, and it remembered her. So it held, not with a grave, but with a home. They did not bury her. They built a room inside the cabin, beneath the floor. The wall shaped it, sealed it, and kept her close. To this day, her cabin still stands. And when the wind blows just right, and the trees creak like voices, some say they hear her whisper, not words, just a feeling, a welcome. If you listen, if you ask, because the mud remembers and the wall still stands.